Honorable Minister, members of the Indian Action Committee, friends all. Before I begin to make my presentation, I want to reflect on the slides that you put up. Evan put up earlier, because he did put up the slides. On one of the slides was the first set of villages to which indentured servants came. And among those villages was Reedon, right across the river on the west coast. And that was Gladstone's estate. But there is a particular history as Guyanese that sometimes we don't know, and we don't take it seriously, and we take it for granted. Because the new technologies of the Industrial Revolution that was taking place in Great Britain at the end of the 18th century, they were producing a number of innovations, and sugar itself was being made in blocks in Guyana in the factories. But at Vredenhoop, the vacuum pan technology was first employed, and the name Demerara crystals arose because for the first time sugar was crystallized at Vredenhoop. And that is why Demerara crystals has been patented by companies abroad, and they're profiting from it. And we need to take this into consideration. The second point I want to make is in relationship to Sambodge Parker, because sometimes we associate sugar with Booker's alone. But Sambodge Parker had a set of estates, and Booker's had a set of estates up to the 1970s, up to nationalization. The third point I want to make in relationship to the slides that Evan put up is on what we call low Gs. I want to remind you that what we call low Gs were not constructed for the East Indian indentured servants. They were first the homes of the slaves. So what became the bongyards were first the nigger yards in slavery. And in a number of the Indian villages, during the first 10 years of indenture, from 1838 to 1848, most of the villages were multiracial. You had both groups, African laborers on the sugar plantations and Indian laborers on the sugar plantations living in the very villages. And this is the kind of history that I am hoping that we could begin to teach in our schools. So when I was asked to speak here today, I was contemplating what should I say. And I said to the organizers that I want to talk about the context within which East Indian immigration came to the shores of Guyana. Because sometimes, as Yog said, we sometimes do not remember context. We are not Indians, we are Guyanese. And there were people here before Indians. And there were people here who produced the contours of the villages. The African slaves. Go back and read History of the Guyanese Working People. And Yog mentioned Walter Rodney as Guyana's foremost historian. He also mentioned the work of Clemcy Charan. And Clemcy Charan do not fall far from Walter Rodney in terms of his own ethos. So today, I want to look at the question of the expansion of East Indian immigration after 1848 and its interconnectedness with the second slavery. I will go on to explain what I mean by the second slavery. So, reflection, every time we reflect and analyze our formative history, we must understand the trials, tribulations, and the travails of the indentured servants when they came. And the trials, travails, and tribulations of the indentured servants were not much different from the trials and travails and tribulations of the slaves. In fact, when the first set of Indians came to Highbury and those plantations, they were told that they had to be tied to specific plantations, which was something that came out of the apprentice system in 1834, when slaves were told that they had to be tied to specific plantations. And it was the Africans out of slavery who came to the defense of the East Indians and said, no, you cannot treat them that way. So we have to understand the intertwinement and the interconnectiveness of our history. History is also important because it helps us to understand the slave-like conditions of indentured servants on the sugar plantations. And Utinka wrote a book called Sugar, Slavery Without Slaves. Slavery and indenture, therefore, were connected. Abolition and emancipation for slavery, we have to remember, did not free the planter class from the mentality of ownership. Sister Mary Noel Menezes, a historian, an Amerindian of Portuguese origin, who taught history at the University of Guyana for many years, wrote this: the Abolition of Slavery Act freed the slaves, but they did not free the slave owner from the mentality of ownership. For the slave owner's mind was conditioned by centuries of looking upon human beings as chattels, without mind, body, soul, identity, or history of their own. My charge to you today, and I'm taking a word from Jung, I know his father quite well, is we have to free our minds from the colonial mentality. We have to free our minds from the colonial mentality. This anniversary, 100 years since the end of indenture, therefore affords us the opportunity to shine light on something that we don't normally shine light on, which is the indentured contract. For students of history, go back, read Duarte Knott. You have the details about the indentured contract in that book, The History of Indians in Guyana. We don't pay attention to the details. As we do that, we will find that it was imposed after 1848. After 1848, 10 years after slavery ended, by the same forces whose minds were conditioned to think about non-white workers as chattel. My task, and I'm a social historian, so my task is to point to the connection between profits and exploitative social and economic arrangements. That is still the guiding principle. This kind of expose is especially important in the Guyanese context. After 100 years since the end of indenture, and 179 years since the end of slavery, note I'm talking about both, because we have to talk about both. We have not solved the problem of the planter mindset. We are yet to solve the problem of the plantation and planter mindset. We will not move forward until we address these historical structural problems. And these are historical structural problems. This is why I chose to go back in my PhD studies to study the period 1838 to 1900. Because it is crucial for us to understand the structure of our everyday social relations. We have to remember that Guyana is not a blank state. It was not a blank slate when the indentured contract was imposed. The African Guyanese working class had been staking their claim for dignified treatment as soon as slavery ended and before slavery ended. and the planter class had to adjudicate the claims of the African people for equal dignity within a global context. Sometimes we forget that there is a global context, wherein the cost of production for sugar and market price were driven by the expansion of slavery. It is in this context that I invoke the concept second slavery. But before I do that, we are producing sugar and it is costing us above 30 cents to produce US. And we can only get 15 or 16 cents. It's a problem. We will not run our house that way. And so we have to have a national discussion on these issues. So what is the second slavery? Since the idea of the second slavery may be new to many of you, let me take some time to explain this construct. The study of the second slavery is gaining global currency in academic circles. I know this is not an academic circle. Because of the structural deficiencies that gripped most of the former colonies, wherein the peoples of African descent, peoples closest to blackness, and indigenous communities have been seemingly permanently shunted to the margins of society. This is a problem. We have to address it. This is especially the case across the Caribbean, the United States of America, and in several areas of Central and South America. The term second slavery is used to explain the rapid expansion of slavery in the 19th century. The 19th century is 1800 to 1900. And that is immediately what happened immediately following the abolition of the slave trade in 1806. Students sometimes do not recognize that the British had abolished the slave trade in 1806, and that in the British colonies, slavery came to an end in 1838, which is 34 years after the slave trade was abolished. During the 19th century, we need to understand that slavery, although abolished, intensified in non-British areas of the world, especially in the United States, which became the home of Jim Crow segregation, and more significantly, in that period, the center or the leader of global cotton production. In Brazil, which became the center and leader of global coffee production, and in Cuba, which became the center and leader of global sugar production. Now, Guyana, until 1815, Guyana was producing three main crops: coffee, cotton, and sugar. After 1815, Guyana started to produce only sugar. Guyana became a monocrop economy until the East Indians established the rice industry at the beginning of the 20th century. The concentration of global commodity production of these products became pivotal in the growth and expansion of industrialization in Britain and northwestern Europe. What do I mean by that? Industrialization in Europe is connected to what we were doing here and what we do here on the plantations. There are several lessons to be learned from this development. First, global commodity producers and free traders defied the imposition of the abolition order. There was a manifold increase in the demand for African slaves. Second, slave production of raw materials for industrial processing in Britain and northwestern Europe led to the expansion of factories and the demand for cheap wage labor. Third, innovative technologies were transferred and agricultural production intensified in the slave zones. And this helped to propel the need for cheap labor or the expansion of slavery. Fourth, the disconnect between white and black peoples in the Americas expanded, and this led to the birth of scientific racism in the USA as a means of justifying slavery. This was the global context within which East Indian indenture was established. We cannot forget these things, because our racial problems is also connected. And we have to go back, we have to understand, we have to study. And we can only solve our problems if we go back, we understand, and we study. British Guyana, therefore, was caught in this global cauldron. I'm calling it a global cauldron. British Guyana, being a British colony, was denied the possibility of expansion of slavery after 1806. At the time of abolition, the colony had a mere 100,000 slaves. When, according to former Prime Minister of Trinidad, Eric Williams, he said that for the land capacity of the country, for the fertility of the soil, in 1800, we needed 2 million people. We only had 100,000 workers who were slaves. Guyana was caught in this conundrum. This is what is called the labor problem by the historians. Faced with the shortage of labor, Guyana chose sugar and moved away from coffee and cotton. Land and labor were consolidated. No one can deny that Guyana needed more labor. This is still the case today. We still have more land than people. But the story of the African and East Indian Guyanese, the majority groups of our population, is related to the struggle for cheap labor. The insertion of East Indians into the labor force in the first 10 years of emancipation was intertwined with the struggles of the African labor force on the sugar estates for improved wages and living conditions. These early trade union struggles are properly covered in our history, and I'm not going to dwell on that. As we mark 100 years since the end of indenture, we need to pay renewed attention to the structure of social and economic relations that gave birth to the continuation and expansion of indentured immigration between 1848 and 1917. I use this periodization because it is my belief that we need to pay more attention to the factors that led to the imposition of the draconian indentured contract after 1848. We must consider the context. This is especially necessary since many of our communities today continue to suffer from the vestiges of the demand for cheap labor, which, incidentally, was the original reason for slavery and indenture. Let us look at some of these factors that I identify, and I can't list all of them. 1. The first experiment with indentured laborers in 1838 was terminated because of the neo-slave nature of indentureship. Remember, it was suspended in 1839 and restarted in 1845. And it was suspended because the first arrivals were treated in similar manner as Africans under slavery. Secondly, the bulk of the African workforce, and we have to correct some of what is written in history. Walter Rodney tried to do this. He tried to do this in his work. The bulk of the African workforce had remained on the sugar plantations after emancipation in 1838. And they demanded better wages and working conditions. They remained, worked on the plantations, and remained in plantation houses, living on the plantations. So there were sugar strikes in 1841, 42, and again in 1847, 48. According to Walter Rodney, these strikes served to strengthen the resolve of the planters to seek a new workforce, because they needed the Africans to work for cheaper wages. So indentured laborers were brought, and the indentured contract was imposed to ensure that they were paid cheaper than the Africans were prepared to work for. Thirdly, we have to remember that even in the 1840s, we have global free trade. So the Sugar Duties Act, which was passed by the British Parliament in 1846, equalized sugar duties between slave and free-produced sugar. It meant that sugar that was being produced by slaves in Cuba and sugar being produced on the plantations in Mauritius, Fiji, British Guyana, and Trinidad, and Jamaica, they were meeting on the world market. The cost of production of the cheaper slave-produced sugar affected the price at which free-produced sugar could be sold. And this acted to push change at the local level in British Guyana, where the result was the imposition of the indentured contract, because you had to tighten the noose around the indentured contract laborers. And so what we had was a depression of wage rates to match the cost of slave-produced sugar. This sent the sugar industry in crisis in the late 1840s. The result was the demand that the majority Afro-Guyanese sugar workers take a 25% pay cut, which they refused. So what happened? When the Afro-Guyanese decided in 1848 that they could not take the 25% pay cut, there were enough indentured served laborers, Portuguese and East Indians, to take their place on the plantations. As a result, the majority of Afro-Guyanese sugar workers left estate residency en masse. And this is how all the villages we are seeing on the coast, Buxton, Victoria, all those villages became overpopulated and overcrowded. So 1848 was the year of change. In the intervening period, although indentured immigrants were tied to specific plantations, there were no rigid contracts. But this was not good enough to meet the challenge for complete control over the labor process. What is worthy of note are the rapid changes, and we have to make note, and I got this from Dorcanal, the rapid changes that took place in the indentured contract. The indentured contract changed in 1846, in 1848, 1851, 1852, 1853, 1854, 1862, and again in 1863. The most drastic changes began to occur in 1848, after the defeat of the sugar strike. These were followed by the changes in 1851 to require the indentured immigrant to be contracted to an estate for 5 years. That is bound with an employer he or she selected. What we have to understand is that each of the change in the indentured contract represented the tightening of the noose around the neck of the indentured immigrant. Each change brought them closer to the conditions of slavery. Two of our historians, Walter Rodney and Alan Adamson, helps us to understand the draconian nature of the indentured contract and its application in the everyday setting. One, Rodney explained that the working of the indentured code was of such that if a laborer was not at work, the expectation of their employer was that they were either in hospital or in jail. There was no middle ground. An unexplained absence from work was classed as desertion. And like all other breaches of civil contract on the part of the laborer, absence constituted a criminal offense punishable by a fine or imprisonment. Adamson, on the other hand, explained that the indentured immigrants were immobilized and insulated from the rest of the society through carefully devised laws, which were designed to keep them unattached from the rest of the population. Insulation and immobility, he said, were maintained through several devices, the most effective of which were the vagrancy laws and a clause in the immigration ordinance which forbade an immigrant to leave an estate without a written pass from the manager. And since the law only authorized but did not compel the employer to issue a pass, it could be used to keep the immigrants in a state of virtual imprisonment. Now, this is like apartheid. How many of you know what was going on in South Africa under apartheid that came to an end only a couple decades ago? So we had apartheid right here. and the East Indian immigrants suffered from apartheid right here. The legal sanctions imposed through the indentured contract on indentured laborers, therefore, distorted the labor market. We did not have a free labor market. It imposed an alternative workforce, which by dint of circumstances, according to Walter Rodney, actively supplanted the African workforce and curtailed the struggle for equal dignity in the colony, which began with the free villages. This is why Alan Adamson wrote a paper called Stagnation and Village Decay after the 1850s. There's a reason for these things. Today, and I'm concluding, Mr. Chairman, today we suffer from the structure of this history in several ways. First, a racial and economic divide, which has now become an importance of culture, is directly connected to this history. Secondly, the major class division in the East Indian community between rich and poor is also directly related to this history. Go into the recesses, the inner cities in Port Moran and some of the villages. Drive through some of the sugar villages. One car can only drive a street at a time. They were produced so that they cannot develop, that they cannot enter the modern world. We have to end this structural stagnation. Thirdly, the colonial mindset is still present in the recesses of our society and acts as a driving force. We have to end the colonial mindset. We have to educate our children from primary, secondary, and university level about the true history of all our peoples. That is the only thing that will set this country free and will propel development. Fourthly, the global international economic climate that helped to shape the economic and social beginnings of the East Indian community is still with us. We can see this in the perpetual crisis in rice and sugar. And I can say that without doubt, because I am a researcher of the rice industry. And I have been researching the rice industry for some time. And it is in perpetual crisis. The Venezuela deal kind of arrested the crisis. But Yoge's father and myself went back some ways. He was the president of the Guyana Rice Producers Association, his father. We will move forward as a people and as a country when we develop the fortitude to understand and speak about this history. If we continue, as my elder and mentor, Brother Yussi Kwayana, said some time ago, he said this in Parliament. He said, all we are doing is throwing dead cats across the fence at each other. And if we continue to do that, if we don't begin a conversation with each other, we will continue to go downhill. We have to speak to each other. We cannot speak past each other. We have to speak with each other. Each of us have to listen to the other. Friends, I would like to end by saying that we have tremendous work to do. And people like myself are willing to put our shoulders to the wheel to do this work of re-educating our communities and creating unity, creating national discourse, creating cohesion in our country. Because more than ever before, we need national discourse and we need cohesion. Thank you.